to welcome Dr. David John Sandifer.
I'm glad to be able to have this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the UK situation. I just want to say that that's not me, that's David Cameron, because it might be confusing. I think it's important, I'm really pleased that we're having this opportunity to talk about the situation in the UK. The reason being that the United Kingdom is the only Western country which has instituted a system of internet filtering by default at the ISP level, the Internet Service Provider level. That's somewhat controversial, we'll get into that. But I think it's worth at least talking about it and looking at it and asking ourselves the question of whether, as a part of a comprehensive package of responses, of solutions to the crisis of child exposure to pornography, whether in Australia we ought to be considering something at the regulatory level. So my purpose here is not to advocate for that, but to raise the question. And as a part of that, then, to shed some light on what's happened in the UK, try to understand what the UK model is and how it came about. We're spending actually most of the time talking about the history of how it came about. I think it's important to understand that what has taken place in the UK didn't come out of nowhere. There's been a process leading up to it. It's a culmination of a national conversation which took place mostly for about 5 years, starting around 2010. Involving activists, child welfare organizations, regulatory bodies, parliamentarians, and the ISPs themselves. So it was a long process leading up to where they are today. And I think it's especially useful for our situation in Australia to try to understand what's happened in the UK, because, as some of you might know, about the same time that in the UK they began sort of discussing this, it began to be something that was sort of part of the conversation, it emerged in Australia as well. And that led to a proposal in 2008 that was mooted by the then Labour government, and it very quickly all went down in flames. And it hasn't really been discussed more in Australia. So very different trajectories in Australia and the UK. So important to try to understand the difference, what happened there. I just want to say, there's no original research contained here. This is sort of repackaging a lot of things that are widely available, sources that are widely available on the internet, with the exception of one little juicy tidbit that I did get just a couple of weeks ago from my contact amongst in the UK Parliament. So you'll be given a little something there, but the rest is all widely available. It's fairly complex to try to give this picture. I've tried to summarize and just highlight the big pieces in a way that hopefully will be helpful to try to get the big picture. Just a couple of maybe to go over a couple of words to kind of set the background. In the UK, the regulatory agency that oversees the internet is called Ofcom, and they oversee broadcasting and communications. There's a group called the Internet Watch Foundation, which is not part of the government. It's a charity, but they monitor child porn in particular, and child abuse sites, and provide a block list to the ISPs there. The British Board of Film Classification, the BBFC, has an interesting role in that they obviously normally focus on films, but since just a few years ago, they've been providing the block list to mobile operators. So they don't deal with internet service providers, but they do deal with mobile operators and provide the block list for them. And then the UK Council for Child Internet Safety, which I'll mention again in a minute, is an advisory group that was brought together a few years ago. Over 200 government agencies, private companies, organizations, to act as an organization to be sort of a clearinghouse to discuss possible solutions and monitor child exposure to, well, not just porn, but issues around internet safety in general. So let's just start with a little background and the timeline. In 2004, Ofcom released a guide for blocking adult sites on mobiles. And the compliance to this was voluntary, but in fact all UK ISPs have complied with this. So this is interesting because it's not often reported when the UK model is discussed, but actually going all the way back to 2004, in the UK, all mobiles are set up so that they're filtering adult content. And there's an age verification process for allowing that filter to be taken off. So that's been in place since 2004. And as I mentioned, it's the film board that oversees that. In 2008, the UK CCIS, the UK Council for Child Internet Safety, was formed, and they were charged, they're an advisory group, but they were charged with monitoring child safety online, devising safety protocols, and publishing a code of practice for the industry. So that's a key group, and there's an important part of the conversation. So all the key players are part of that. May 2010, when the coalition government published their manifesto, one of the points in their manifesto was that they would tackle the commercialization and sexualization of childhood. And as you'll see, politicians' manifestos don't always align with what they actually do. But in this case, David Cameron, anyway, seemed to have been in earnest, and he did follow through on this, and we'll see what that looked like. In November 2010, an organization was formed called Safer Media, which was a public advocacy group, and they hosted a parliamentary conference called The Harms That Pornography Does. And they recruited Claire Perry, essentially, as their ally in Parliament, and then she was the one who, for the next several years, was championing this cause. So the next day after the conference, she held an adjournment debate in Parliament, calling specifically for ISP-level default-on filters. And so the vocabulary they were talking about filters that are administered by the internet service provider, as opposed to one that would be in one's home via software. So the internet service provider filters before it reaches the home or the device. Then there were a number of reports that came out. Part of this was, there were some headline-grabbing child abuse cases, which were sort of heightening the concern, I think, in the public sphere about this. And in June 2011, the Bailey Commission published their report on commercialization and sexualization of childhood. That's something that often gets referred to and had a big impact on the conversation. It was broader than pornography. It's about sexualization, and broader than the internet. It's about sexualization of childhood in general terms. In April 2012, Claire Perry's group put out their parliamentary, their report. So it was a parliamentary inquiry into online child protection, and part of their recommendations was, again, ISP level default on filtering. And this is a quote from that report, from the recommendations: a network level opt-in system maintained by ISPs that delivered a clean internet feed to customers as standard that allows them to choose to receive adult content would preserve consumer choice but provide an additional content barrier that protected children from accessing age-inappropriate material. So that was the proposal that was put forth then. The Daily Mail jumped in. It was very important in the UK. It's the most popular newspaper there, as you might know. Quite ironically, if you've ever been to their website, you know that the whole right side column is pretty objectionable kind of content that they're putting out themselves. So it's ironic because you'll see these articles talking about the terrible effect of porn on children, and then right alongside are pretty sort of soft porn links that they're putting out. But nonetheless, they were important in this, and they still are. It's one of their campaigns. So Block Online Porn, they came out with an editorial in support of Claire Perry, and then they sort of hammered this for a while. These are just some of the headlines. Children grew up addicted to online porn sites. On internet, porn turned my beautiful boy into a hollow, safe, self-hating shell, and so on and so forth. I think Liz was got a story in the Daily Mail just yesterday. Liz Walker, was it the Daily Mail? I think, and it was a similarly sort of sensational headline. So they're on this beat, and that was a significant part of the campaign in the UK. April 2012, a petition was presented. It was put together by Safer Media, and they called it the Safety Net Campaign, and they presented it at 10 Downing Street, and you can see Claire Perry there. She's brunette, third from the right. And then just a little bit after that, Claire Perry was appointed as the Prime Minister's advisor for preventing the commercialization and sexualization of childhood. In July 2013, this was mentioned a little bit earlier today, the Children's Commissioner published a report titled "Basically Porn is Everywhere," a quote from one of those that were interviewed, and provided a sort of a comprehensive overview of the impact of children, porn on children in the UK. And then in July 2013, David Cameron made a speech announcing that after months of deliberation with the internet service providers, he'd come to a voluntary agreement with them. And it's a really good speech, I think. I made 40 copies of it. If you're interested, you can grab one at the front here. And in the speech, he said that the major internet service providers in the UK had agreed to a default on filter that they would be rolling out in the coming months. I just thought I'd give you a couple excerpts from this speech. So this is: the internet can sometimes be given a sort of special status in debate. In fact, it can almost be seen as beyond debate. That to raise concerns about how people should access the internet or what should be on it is somehow naive or backwards looking. People sometimes feel that they're being told almost the following: that an unruled internet is just a fact of modern life. Any fallout from that is just collateral damage, and that you can as easily legislate what happens on the internet as you can legislate the tides. He would say it much more convincingly and powerfully. I'm sure. So you can watch the video if you want. I'm sure it's online. And then this: a free and open internet is vital, but in no other market and with no other industry do we have such an extraordinarily light touch when it comes to protecting our children. Children can't go into the shops or the cinema and buy things meant for adults or have adult experiences. We rightly regulate to protect them. But when it comes to the internet, in the balance between freedom and responsibility, we've neglected our responsibility to children. Just a few months later, there was a formal statement by the major internet service providers in the UK. The four major providers are BT, Sky, Virgin Media, and TalkTalk. And they announced an agreement to provide ISP-level filters. These would be provided to new customers within 2 months, and then they agreed to providing it to existing customers on a rolling basis, with that promise to be completed by December 14, which to the best of my knowledge, it was completed by December 2014. So what does that look like? This is the current situation. There's no regulation involved in the UK as of right now, no legislation. It's a voluntary compliance with a code of practice. It involves the four major ISPs, who together control about 93% of the market. That does leave a number of smaller internet service providers who have not complied with this. Some of them are making a point of saying they will not comply with it. But the four major ones have gone along. Each ISP provides its own ISP-level filtering. So there's no government involvement in blacklists or in the filtering itself, except, again, for the child abuse material blacklist. That's provided to them. But just the adult content, the way of filtering that is done by each ISP separately, and they typically, well, in each case, they have a company they've subcontracted that to. They do it in slightly different ways. When the announcement was made, Cameron said that it would be a default-on system. In fact, it is and it isn't. So in the case of BT and Virgin, it's what they're calling a forced choice system. And that means that customers get repeated emails saying, you need to make a choice, you need to go to this link and show that you're the owner of this service, of this account, and choose whether or not you want to filter. It's quite a robust system, because if you don't do it after a number of warnings, then you're told that by a certain date your service will be cut off unless you choose something. So it truly is a forced choice. They don't make a choice for you, but they'll pull your internet service if you don't make a choice. Sky and TalkTalk both have a default on system. meaning that they do the same thing. They send a number of new customers, it's pretty simple. They just get that as a page and they register. Existing customers, when it was rolled out, were told that by a certain date, the filter would be put in if they did nothing. And if they wanted to not have the filter, they would need to go to this page and tick that they didn't want the filter. Again, each filter is different, and it's customizable. You can sort of tick what you want to have filtered and what you don't want to have filtered, but each one is a little bit different. Big question that comes up is, well, what are the take-up rates? And there's a huge variability here. It's really interesting. British Telecom reported in June 2015 a 6% take-up rate. It's pretty low. Virgin a little bit better, 12%. TalkTalk 12.4%. Sky, but that was before TalkTalk instituted their default on. So that at that time, TalkTalk was using a forced choice. Sky reported 30 to 40%, a bit broad range, but they reported that in June. And then in December 2015, I reported separately that it was now 62% of all their customers who had left the filter on. So you see a radical difference between when it's a default on versus whether it's a forced choice. This was approached in the UK, as I mentioned, not through legislation, but through a voluntary agreement with the internet service providers. From the beginning, Cameron sort of threatened that there would be legislation if they didn't comply. That was sort of the stick. But he wanted to take more of a free market approach and let them take the lead. But there's been an ongoing effort parallel to that to introduce legislation. And it's been Baroness Howe in the House of Lords who's repeatedly introduced her online safety bill. She's introduced it 5 times in 5 years, and it's never gone through. But just this past December, it's gone through the committee, but the government has said that they're opposed to it. So that's unlikely that will go any further. However, there's an interesting kind of wrinkle in this. You may have read about this back in October 2015. November 2015. The Court of Justice of the European Union ruled that internet filtering violates European norms for free speech and free flow of information. And so that immediately provoked a response the very next day from David Cameron, who in the House said, when I read my Daily Mail this morning, I sputtered over my cornflakes. We worked so hard to put in place those filters. And then he promised, he said, I can tell the House that we will legislate to put our agreement with internet companies on this issue into the law of the land so that our children would be protected. So he didn't back down, and he also claimed that he'd received an exemption, that the UK would be exempt from this and that they would be putting legislation in place. So ironically, it's sort of forced the hand of the government to have legislation. And that's the sort of the inside information that we have. It's imminent that we'll be hearing very soon that this legislation is about to happen in the UK. Criticism. Well, obviously it's controversial. There's been a lot of discussion and criticism about whether this is a good way to move forward. There are obviously free speech concerns, and there have been some websites blocked that were not pornographic, and many people have raised some concerns about how that's happened. There is a whitelist, so when there's a false, that's a false positive. When a website is blocked, it shouldn't be blocked. They can make that known to the internet service provider, and it's just been whitelisted. There are also obviously false negatives, so no internet filtering system is perfect. There will still be a small percentage of pornography that gets through. That's a concern, that it lulls people into a sense of complacency and that porn can still get through. I put this one in brackets because before this was instituted in the UK, one of the things that you heard a lot, something you heard a lot in Australia when this was debated, was that it was technically not feasible or that it would really slow down the internet and make it unusable. I haven't heard any of that since it's happened in the UK. So if that's the case, at least it's not being reported. It doesn't seem to have had any real technical difficulties. The Liberal Democrats in the UK have been steadfastly opposed to this. But the flip side of that is that the two major parties, Labour and the Conservatives, have both come out strongly in favor of it. So In the UK, even though there has been criticism, it doesn't seem that there's been a firestorm of criticism, and it seems like it's pretty secure. That seems to be where the conversation is. Actually, you look online at the response, the criticism largely comes from outside the UK. See a lot of American civil libertarians very upset about this. What about Australia? Well, here's the current regulatory landscape. The Australian Communications and Media Authority, ACMA, is responsible for the regulation of the internet. It has the power to make industry code when none is present or when the industry code is insufficient. Under the current code, which is one the industry has put together, adult content hosted in Australia must be behind age verification mechanism. Don't think this is enforced, but that's the code. That if it's hosted in Australia, then there must be an age verification mechanism. ACMA also provides a blacklist to ISPs for child porn and child abuse sites. There's about 1,000 websites that are blocked in Australia because of that list that ACMA provides. In other words, this is more or less, I didn't put this together, someone else did, but it's a sort of a summary of the situation. On the domestic side, adult content is regulated by ACMA and theoretically not accessible. And on the overseas side, adult content is not regulated by ACMA, and there's no kind of blocks in place unless they're put in place at the individual level with software on devices. There has been, as I mentioned at the beginning, some discussion about filtering in Australia. In 2003, there was a report put out by the Australia Institute that I think Michael Flood mentioned earlier, and he was involved with it, regulating youth access to pornography. It created quite a storm at the time. This is 13 years ago. But it created a storm because it exposed how much exposure there was. And that conversation began at that time. In 2007, the Liberal government proposed a national filter scheme. In 2008, Stephen Conroy proposed, so they were in power then, never came to pass. Then when Labour came into power, Stephen Conroy proposed, and this is the notorious attempt by Stephen Conroy in 2008 for a clean feed filter. It was called Clean Feed. And it hit a huge amount of opposition, well-coordinated, very intense opposition. Part of the issue was that the filtering system that he was proposing was going to involve a government list, and there were a lot of questions about what would be on the list and who would decide and so forth. And so a lot of civil liberty type free speech concerns, and so it was withdrawn. In 2013, the coalition and opposition promised mandatory ISP level filters, but they were later withdrawn. So a few questions just to close to shape maybe how we think about this. Can free speech concerns be adequately addressed with an ISP level filter? That's the biggest question that constantly comes up. Can they be addressed in a way that's satisfactory and still have filters which protect children? Secondly, would a voluntary scheme be sufficient, or is regulation required? In the UK, as I mentioned, we started with a voluntary scheme. We're now saying that there will be regulation. Could we have a voluntary scheme with the ISPs in Australia? Is that a simple way forward that wouldn't involve regulation? Does ACMA have the authority to require ISP level filtering without legislation? There's an open question there. It may be that within their charter, ACMA could actually require this without further legislation being introduced. Would a mandatory website rating system be more effective? Here's another option, is actually attaching sort of a built-in rating. Something like this was attempted a few years ago. There was a group called the ICRA, and it was an attempt to have an international rating system, just like we do for movies and other forms of media. It never really took off. And the problem with that option, of course, is that it has to be universal for it to work. But in theory, it's sort of the gold standard. If you could get that, then you wouldn't have as many false positives or false negatives as you do with a filtering system, which is relying on the software to figure out if it's an objectionable site or not. And then this is the biggie: is the UK-style ISP level filtering regime politically realistic in Australia? There seems to be a lack of interest in the political sphere with this. Though, having said that, a Senate inquiry, which was started in December, so we spoke about that. I don't know, do I have time to take questions, or how do we?
Not really.
Not really.
But
I'll just take one. Can I
take one? Of course you can.
I've actually got two really quick questions.
Oh,
Pushing it.
First of all, are there actually any laws, if you're allowing your underage child to watch pornography in your home, are there any laws against that, or is that fine to do if you want to let your kid watch pornography? Well, that's my opinion.
I have no idea. Is there a lawyer here?
There was a talk on this before, and apparently it is illegal if you're using porn to groom a child.
Any exposure to underage children, the law in Victoria that can enter failure to disclose those textbooks came out in September 2015.
I know our previous speakers shared that it was technically child abuse to show child porn. So, but I don't know the laws. Sorry.
In New Zealand, it's punishable by 3 years offence to register as for the minor to pornography, and I believe it's a similar law in Australia, and it's pretty much similar in Canada.
Sorry. Glad to chat 101.
Thanks so much, David, joining